I think you're going to see a lot of repeats in the themes of this topic, and certainly when we go into the panel discussion, but hopefully I'll still be able to keep you awake after lunch this afternoon. So, when you look at clinical trials in Asia, I'm going to do a little bit of a background, and I will try to keep to time. You know, many years ago, the theme was, let's just throw a few sites in Asia. They're going to recruit really fast to us, and it's really cheap. But as you know, the industry has evolved after the last few years. So there's an enormous opportunity in Asia. When you look at the Asian continent, it's a significant contributor to the world population. So it's the largest continent in the world. It has the most populace of the world. And it's also the most diverse, politically, economically, culturally. And of all of us in this room, all of us who have attended to a lot of these conferences and all the work that we do on a day-to-day basis, we also understand the incredible market impact that the Asian countries can offer us in the pharmaceutical industry. Sorry, I didn't want to have that one there. Okay. So Asia is the fastest growing region in the global pharmaceutical market. If you look at markets like Europe, the US, Japan, they're not growing at the rates that we're seeing in the Asian, the Latin America, or the emerging markets. Practical considerations. One of the things we have to think about when we're conducting and we're planning to conduct studies in Asia is there are some specific clinical trial challenges. There's a phenomenal demand to conduct clinical research trials in Asia. You just saw the map, you saw the populations, you know the market strategy. We want to market our products in the Asian countries. So there's a phenomenal increase in the number of trial activities, not only by multinational companies, but also in Asian regional companies and within local companies in some of these very large countries, such as China, India, Korea, Taiwan. The other thing to consider in the Asia region, clinical research is relatively new in many of these countries. Some of these countries have only been doing trials for approximately 10 years. It's very different than going to a place like the North America, where they've been conducting research for over 30 years, Western Europe. The other thing, as we all know, is we're looking at the cost to bring a new molecule to market, a new compound to market. We're trying to cut our costs in the industry. We are outsourcing more. And a lot of the sponsors are downsizing. We have lean teams that we're working with, and we tend to outsource more. So there's a demand for that key talent in the Asia region, and there's not a large supply of that talent. The other thing that we're seeing based upon consultations with the regulatory agencies, based upon the competition in the market for these molecules, are you number 1, are you number 7 to the market? The strategic component, the complexity to operationalize these clinical studies in the Asia market as part of the global studies. You look at supply of staff with experience. We all know this. In Asia, you tend to see people job hopping because there's the demand out there. That, all of us want that talent, and we're willing to pay for that talent in some cases. CRO capacity in Asia. We are seeing a very large upswing in the amount of CROs in Asia, the global bandwidth, the regional bandwidth. Is it a niche CRO? Is it a CRO that has expertise across all therapeutic areas? Do they work in all countries? And I'll get to that in a little bit. When you look at the clinical trial site environment in Asia, and you look at in India, China, almost anywhere in Asia, there are a lot of sites. We're seeing more and more sites that are getting GCP certified, but we also have a lot of limitations. In a country like China, there's only so many GCP accredited sites. There's no extra sites. So if there's 15 to 20 pharmaceutical companies all doing a study in type 2 diabetes, we're all competing with that site. And when you look at some of the sites that do have that expertise to conduct those clinical research trials, they often have 20 other trials ongoing at the same time. So it's certainly something that has to be considered when you're designing your study, when you're thinking about your program. Are you going to be able to target the sites? Do you have those relationships with those sites so that they're going to want to do your study? Is your study the most interesting? When you think about sometimes with the CROs, do they have that complete geographical footprint? Or are they only in a couple countries? Do they have the global expertise? Do they have that local expertise? And then one of the things I think it has to do when you talk about supply versus demand, especially with talent in Asia, is there does tend to be a lot of turnover and a lot of limited experience, often in the most case with those CRAs. The other thing to consider when you're designing your clinical trials, and it's certainly something I experience on a day-to-day basis, when you look at the complexity in the regulatory environment, and I won't go into great detail because we did spend the morning talking about the regulatory complexities. When you think about in Asia, we have a lot of regulatory authorities, and they're not all in alignment. So there is differences within each country. Some countries may have an alignment, others don't have an alignment. In some countries, there's a lot of uncertainty within the regulatory authority, so it's something we certainly have to consider. Also, when we are planning our clinical research trials, we really want as near simultaneous approvals and registrations. Many, many years ago, a lot of companies would do all their work in the US or in Europe and then come to Asia as an afterthought. And then you have about a 7 to 8 year drug lag. It really doesn't do very well for you in a marketing environment. So it's something you do want to consider. How many CPPs are you going to need? Can you do early work in Asia? Are you only doing your phase 3 pivotal trials in Asia? It's something you want to negotiate with your global teams. It's something you want your teams to be aware of, really in the preclinical stages. What is our market going to be in Asia? And how are we going to get to that market? What is it we need to do? You need to have that understanding of the regulatory environment within Asia. So some of the things, some of the nuances in terms of the region, and right now I'm going to compare it to the US, but you could compare it to the Americas and certainly to Western Europe. So I talked a little bit about staffing earlier, especially when you talk about CRAs. In some of the very mature environments, you tend to have a pool of very, very experienced staff. I used to work with staffs, they were CRAs for 10, 15, 20 years. That is unheard of in Asia. Whereas in Asia, it's many new to the industry. Clinical research is new. And as more and more companies go into certain countries to conduct more and more clinical trials, there is going to be a very limited pool. When you're working with some of your CROs, you're going to get a lot of new staff. You're not going to get all very experienced staff. When we talk about sites, and I have to say in the US, they're not all really good. There are some bad sites there, and I'm from there, so I can say it. But you do tend to have a lot more experienced sites with GCP. Some of the very large medical teaching institutions, the tertiary care facilities, their ethics committees require 3 to 5 day GCP classes for anyone who's going to work in a clinical trial, and they must pass an exam, they must be certified. Their whole focus is patient safety. When we look at Asia, and it's not all sites, there are some phenomenal sites in Asia. But as these sites get saturated, as we start to move out to the tier 2, the tier 3 cities, the investigators who've never done a clinical trial before, they require a lot of training, a lot of hand-holding. They can get you the patients, but we need to ensure they understand good clinical practice. Oftentimes, you may want to consider working with an intermediary, perhaps an SMO. These are sites with very large patient loads, 200 to 300 patients per day. The doctors that are doing some of these clinical trials, they're doing this because they're passionate about a research, but they also have to take care of their patients. So they have very, very limited time. The regulatory environment. In some of the Western countries, they do have a consistent regulatory environment. They do have really a process if you want to consult with the regulatory authority. Which if you think in some of the Asia countries, and there's been enormous improvement, but sometimes it can be rather opaque, it can be vague, it changes frequently. Sometimes you can negotiate, sometimes you can't negotiate, but you want to clearly understand, and if you have a local affiliate, if you're working with a CRO that has a presence in that country, you really want to have a very good understanding. When we talk about quality, and I know several people have touched on this, and I did think it was important to consider, it's not always low cost to come to Asia. You need to consider all of your costs at the front end of your trial. If you think you're coming in from a low cost perspective, and in the end, because you had quality concerns and you had to remonitor everything, then you did not save any money. So when you think about quality in some other, the more developed regions in the world, it does tend to be high. But there are bad quality sites in the US. The difference is the government will debar them and they lose their medical license and sometimes go to jail. But it's really a low touch approach. You can have risk-based monitoring, target monitoring, perhaps only monitoring a certain percentage of your patients. In Asia, some sites can certainly be equal. I've had very, very good inspections occur in Asia, but sometimes they do require a lot more hand-holding. They have higher patient loads. Their staff are really stretched, so they may require a lot more from us. And then in terms of brand equity, certainly in many countries, they view, sites view the sponsor, we're the brand, we're the face of our companies, and they're gonna help us get our drugs registered. They're gonna help us launch our drugs. They're gonna help us with our drugs on the market. Now, sometimes you may not have presence in a country in Asia, and you may want to leverage the CRO you're working with. You want to have a really good relationship with that CRO because they're the face of your company, and you want to make sure that they are representing you in the way that you want to be represented. Something to consider, and I did not put in any kind of flexible resourcing model or that embedded resource model that was discussed yesterday. But there's things to consider in the Asia region, both the pros and cons. Do you want a single large global CRO that perhaps has the bandwidth around the world conducting your study for you? A, it's simple. It allows consistency across your program. You can leverage training. You can leverage using SOPs around the world. Sometimes the cons can be they may not be aware, if they don't have a large presence in Asia, of those specific needs in Asia, and there could potentially be operational challenges. You can consider, and that first one was if it's managed globally. If you have a single global CRO that's managed regionally, the pro is you've got that regional expertise that can really give you the information you need about the countries in Asia. The con is you need to make sure you stay aligned with what's going on in your global program. Are they aligned with their global colleagues around the world? And the other consideration is multiple regional CROs managed regionally. Sometimes that's good because it's the best vendor. They know that country, they know the region really well. What you have to understand, and certainly in my experience, is I have a really lean team. I don't have the time, I don't have the headcount to manage all those different vendors. But I think it was discussed yesterday, and I certainly agree with it. It's not one size fits all. You have to think about what is best for your product, what is best for your program so that you can get your product registered in a country. Now, I bring this slide up because it's certainly something I experience, and I don't know if others do, but I tend to work with a lot of people from around the world, and a lot of people around the world consider themselves the outside experts. They know everything because they read the regulations, but sometimes sitting in our region, We know the regulations, but we also know how to interpret the regulations. So if you have a colleague sitting, and I'll use my example, I have a colleague sitting in the US who may try to negotiate something different with me because they read the regulations. At least I have the expertise, I have the contacts to Asia to say, yes, that's what the regulation states, but this is how that regulatory agency interprets that regulation. And it's very important that they are aware of that. Also, sometimes the thought process might be, it's black and white, show me the regulation, or I do not agree with your suggestion. And where I tend to see some of the teams in some of the regions I work with is they don't really understand that gray area, and again, that's the interpretation. So I have 2 slides left, so I'll be right on track for time. One of the things, certainly when you're designing your trials, when you're conducting your trials, there's certain efforts that are required from sponsors, especially when you're outsourcing work with a CRO. We all have responsibilities. We need to set very clear expectations from the offset. We need to be specific on how we want to work with our CROs, who is going to take what responsibility. We want to stay closely involved in projects. We don't want to micromanage if we don't need to micromanage. We are engaging CROs. We want them to do the work. Again, if you're a lean organization, you don't have the time to repeat the work as it is. You want to communicate as much as possible. Face-to-face meetings do help. There's a cost involved. There's video conferencing. Leverage technology. Take advantage of the learning opportunity. If you're working with CROs that have presence in the region, you can learn quite a bit from them. And one of the key things with all of the CROs you work with, it is a partnership. It may not be an official partnership, but it is a partnership because you may be working with them again, and you never know, you may be working for them in the future. And then from the CRO perspective, support your client. Be aware. Sometimes we as clients may come across as difficult and demanding, but you have to understand the timelines we have in the background. Be prepared to provide feedback and guidance. Adapt to the scale of your client. Know your client. Know the culture of your client. Recognize that there may be very, very limited resource on that client side, on that sponsor side. Again, get to know us. And again, review the relationship as a partnership. It's a very small industry. We all may work together again in the future. We may be working for each other in the future. So I think it's really important to have a very good relationship. And with that, I am going to end my presentation.